Robert, welcome to A House for Arts. It's such a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me, Lara.
You've done so many different kinds of things pertaining to the arts on some level, Robert. I know you've written several articles about contemporary art and motherhood. You're working on a book project right now about contemporary American art and maternal subjectivity and maternal issues. I know you've also interviewed artists yourself. So we've got two interviewers here, right?
Yes.
You've interviewed artists for the Brooklyn Rail magazine, which is great. And you've designed dance costumes, which is amazing. And I'd love to talk about all these things, but tell us for right now about your current book project. What's the title of your book and what's it all about?
Sure. It's titled Mirroring Mothers, Witnessing Maternal Subjectivity in Contemporary Art. And it's about artists who are mothers making work about that experience. It builds on a long body of scholarship by people like Rachel Ep-Buller and Andrea Leese, who've looked at prominent artists like Renee Cox, Mary Kelly, and Catherine Opie. And I'm trying to focus on some emerging and underrepresented artists, particularly in the last 10 years or so. Historically, there's been a lot of pressure on artists not to disclose that they're mothers within the art world for fear that their work won't be taken seriously. Same thing happens in corporate America. They get worried about being passed over for job promotions. And even in academia, fear of being put on the mommy track instead of the tenure track.
Yeah, as if your work and your family life always have to be opposed. And in order to make your work progress, you have to ignore your family somehow. And that's particularly tricky for mothers, right?
Right. And what a lot of these recent artists are doing is really pushing back against that marginalization, and they're saying that we can be artists and mothers, and we can make work about our experience as mothers. That's important subject matter for art.
You know, I know you've also curated a show, an art exhibition recently called The Vision of Care. And doesn't it also deal with something similar to that it deals with, it actually features what are called artist mothers, or what you've referred to as artist mothers, and it uses the ethics of care to showcase, painting and photography and installation. Can you tell us a little bit about that exhibition and one particular artist that you think was really exemplary of this theme?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. I was super grateful to the Woodstock Artists Association and Museum for inviting me to curate this exhibition, The Vision of Care. I took entries from 23 artists who were working within 50 miles of Woodstock, and they submitted work about parenting, about nature and the environment, and sometimes about loss. All of this is happening during the pandemic. The idea for the show first came from the work of artist Meryl Lederman Ukeles, who in 1969 proposed an exhibition titled Care in her Maintenance Art Manifesto, in which she talked about maternal labor, maintenance labor, and sanitation.
And these are the early years of the second wave of feminism, right? So there are a lot of women artists talking about these things.
Yep, exactly. And it's in pandemic parlance, we would refer to all of this as essential labor today. And Meryl Lederman Ukeles was already dealing with these issues and the environment. So as I put the exhibition together, it was important for me to foreground the artist mothers in the exhibition, because historically, a lot of the conversation and theory about care has come out of that kind of work of people like Lederman Ukeles or theorists like Sarah Ruddock. So one of the artists was Kehori Kamie, who made a piece, a sort of explosive expressionist sculpture about the challenges she's had breastfeeding as a mother, a topic which is often accompanied with unfair feelings of shame, but she gives
and very taboo, right?
Yes.
A lot of mothers don't feel very comfortable saying, well, it hasn't always been a cakewalk trying to breastfeed my child,
exactly.
right?
And that's what's so important about what so many of these artists are doing. They're giving voice and form to feelings that have often been felt in private. You had mentioned the second wave feminism, and the mantra was always the personal is political, and I think that still operates in this work today.
That sounds like it. Now that we've been talking about the personal is political, I'm curious to know, Robert, first of all, how did you get so interested in contemporary art? And more specifically as a man, what made you want to learn more about motherhood in particular?
Yeah, my interest in contemporary art, I owe to Susan Stewart, who was my teacher and my painting teacher in high school. She's a very prominent artist in the region in a number of collections. She introduced me to the word postmodernism. She used to bring us to the Whitney Museum of American Art's biennial, which every 2 years they have the most cutting-edge, avant-garde art, often very provocative. And she brought us down at a time of it was the height of the culture wars in the early and mid-90s, when work by Robert Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano was being censored, but she still had the courage to bring us there, and she knew this was important. And from there, I went on to art school, and as I was making art, I was just plagued by all these questions like, why are we making art? Why is this important? And I found the space to think through those issues in my classes with art historian Dr. Lucy Bowditch, and in particular her art criticism classes. And from there, I went on to study art criticism in graduate school with Donald Cuspit, very prominent critic and scholar. And both he and Dr. Bowditch have been just great mentors and friends ever since.
Right. I mean, the mentorship piece is important. And then was there anything a little more, a moment in your own personal life that drove you to be so interested in mothers in particular?
Yeah, it was interesting because it started kind of theoretical. I was looking at a lot of psychoanalytic theory and philosophy that was challenging the notion that as individuals, we become an individual by separating with the mother, that in fact, we become who we are by virtue of our relationship with one another, and that people respond to us. But then a lot of that theory began to intersect with reality when my wife Claire had our 2 children during the course of doing her master's degree. Wow. And I began to see a lot of her experience reflected in the things that I had been reading.
Right.
And at that point, I could have said, oh, maybe I'll start writing about artist parents, having just become one. But it became important for me to bear witness to the experience of mothers. And I think in part because I saw that our experiences as a mother and a father, respectively.
And both in academia, right?
To some extent. Yeah. And so at home we try to divide the labor very equally, but culturally we're regarded very differently. So when I would go to the grocery store, I'd have one of our children in this carrier, almost like a kangaroo pouch, on my body, and our other child would be in the grocery cart, and people would stop and applaud and be like, "Wow, super dad, look at you!" And I'm like, I guess that's nice, but mothers who go to the store with 2 children aren't getting that kind of applause.
They're not seen as heroic,
no,
right?
No.
It's just, they're just doing what they need to do.
Yeah, more often than not, they're given a dirty look if the child, God forbid, acts like a child and makes a peep. So it's, culturally, motherhood and fatherhood are valued very, very differently, and that's why I thought it was really important to bear witness to these maternal experiences.
And it sounds like, because it sounds like you're dealing, Robert, with a lot of these ideas about work and the value of work in both what you're curating and what you're writing about. As we're entering this post-pandemic era, I think it's become very obvious in the wider culture how we haven't traditionally valued the unpaid work of child rearing and home care that mothers and women have traditionally done. So I'm kind of curious, both from your perspective writing about that and from also teaching students sometimes, what would you tell younger generations who are now going to break out into this post-pandemic world, start their careers, maybe start families? What would you advise for them to do in terms of how they value work and how they value family?
Yeah, it's tough for me to give practical advice on how to balance work and home. I'm still struggling with that too. But I think the advice I have for all of us is to really be listening to these artist mothers and theorists, because they've been working through these issues of care, which have to do with how do we acknowledge our mutual dependence on one another, yet still value each other as individuals. So I think of someone like Rebecca Tolley, an artist in our region who was in the Vision of Care show. She had been making work about contingent labor in academia, and then when she became a mother, started to sort of translate some of that work into that language. Or Sarah Irvin, who figures pretty prominently in my writing. She had done one piece that consisted of 2,400 cards. They look like time cards or invoices in which she kept track of her breastfeeding sessions with her child. And both of those artists sort of point out that we don't quite yet have a language for talking about care, maternity in our culture.
And why do you think that is? And, both from kind of thinking on your own experience and also conversing with and looking at the works of these artist mothers, why do you think it is we don't have a kind of supportive language about maternity and care in our culture?
Yeah, I think it's really of feminist concern. It's had to do with the way the labor of women in general and mothers in particular has been marginalized and devalued. Another reason that as a man writing about this, I find it important to use what I can to give voice to these artists.
And I'm wondering too if, as a man, like, do you also see yourself as something like a role model for other younger men, perhaps, that when you're paying more attention to this, and it sounds like you're showing a lot more empathy to those with experiences very different from yours. Do you see that as something that could maybe model a sort of new way of thinking about the world, particularly for young men?
Sure, I would hope so. And I would say it's not a new way of thinking, but a way of thinking that's been forged by many of these artist mothers and theorists. So Sarah Ruddock talks about maternal thinking. I think it's a kind of thinking that we men need to engage with. There are problems, crises in childcare, structural racism, environmental degradation that were happening long before the pandemic that have been sort of highlighted in the last year and a half. The pandemic
exacerbated all of these issues.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it's not enough to go back to a pre-pandemic normal. So art that's about maternity, I really don't see as a niche topic. It's really getting to fundamental issues about how we structure labor, how we think about care, how we regard genders in our society. So it's really something that men and everyone needs to be thinking about.
Yeah, it's absolutely universal.
Yes.
Robert, thank you so much for being on A House for Arts. It was such a pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much, Lara, for having me here.